Open a bottle of bubbly. Yeah. Here's to another goddamn new year. And outside, 2 million drunk Bostonians are getting ready to sing Auld Lang Syne out of tune. I sit there in my easy chair, looking at the clouds, orange with celebration. I wonder if you're out there. Hey! The ice of Boston is muddy and reflects no light, day or night. I slip on it every time. Open the third bottle of bubbly. Yeah, and I take that bottle of champagne, go into the kitchen, stand in front of the kitchen window, and I take all my clothes off, take that bottle of champagne, and I pour it on my head, feel a cascade through my hair and across my chest, and the phone rings. And it's my mother. And she says, "Hi, honey, how's Boston?" And I stand there all alone on New Year's Eve, buck naked, drenched in champagne, looking at a bunch of strangers, looking at them, looking at me, looking at them, and I say, "Oh, fine, Mom. How's Washington? Hey, the ice of Boston is muddy and reflects no light, day or night, and I slip on it every time." Hey, the ice of Boston is muddy and reflects no light, day or night, and I slip on it every time, yeah. So I guess the party line is I followed you up here. Well, I don't know about that. Mainly because knowing about that would involve knowing about some pathetic, ridiculous, and absolutely true things about myself that I'd rather not admit to right now. I woke up at 3 a.m. with the radio on, that Gladys Knight and the Pip song on, about how she'd rather live in his world with him than live in her own world alone. And I laid there, head spinning, trying to fall asleep, and I thought to myself, "Oh, Gladys, girl, I love you, but oh, get a life! Hey, the ice of Boston is muddy and reflects no light, midday or night, and I slip on it every time." Hey, the ice of Boston is muddy and reflects no light, midday or night, and I slip on it every
Hal's eldest brother, Oren Incandenza, got out of competitive tennis when Hal was 9 and Mario nearly 11. This was during the period of great pre-experialist upheaval and the emergence of the fringe CUSP of Johnny Gentle, famous crooner, and to the tumescence of ONAnism. At late 17, Oren was ranked in the low 70s nationally. He was a senior. He was at that awful age for low 70s player where age 18 and the terminus of a junior career are looming, and either one, you're going to surrender your dreams to the show and go to college and play college tennis, or two, you're going to get your full spectrum of gram negative and cholera and amoebic dysentery shots and try to eke out some kind of sad diasporic existence on a Eurasian satellite pro tour and try to hop those last few competitive plateau up to show caliber as an adult. Or three, you don't know what you're going to do, and it's often an awful time. ETA tries to dilute the awfulness a little by letting 8 or 9 postgraduates stay on for 2 years and serve in the Linz platoon of prorectors in exchange for room and board and travel expenses to small, sad satellite tourneys. And Oren's being directly related to ETA administration obviously gave him kind of a lock on the prorector appointment if he wanted it, but a prorector's job was only for maybe at most a few years. It was regarded as sad and purgatorial. And then, of course, what then? What are you going to do after that? Etc. Oren's decision to attend college pleased his parents a great deal, though Mrs. Averill Incandenza especially had gone out of her way to make it clear that whatever Oren decided to do would please them because they stood squarely behind and in full support of him, Oren, and any decision his very best thinking yielded. But they were still in favor of college, privately, you could tell. Oren was clearly not ever going to be a professional caliber adult tennis player. His competitive peak had come at 13, when he'd gotten to the 14 and under quarterfinals of the national clays in Indianapolis, Indiana, and in the quarters had taken a set of the second seed. But starting soon after that, he'd suffered athletically from the same delayed puberty that had compromised his father when himself had been a junior player, and having boys, he'd cleaned the clocks of at 12 and 13 become now seemingly overnight mannish and deep chested and hairy legged, and starting now to clean Oren's own clock at 14 and 15. This had sucked some kind of competitive afflatus out of him, broken his tennis spirit. Oren and his USTA ranking had nosedived through 3 years until it leveled off somewhere in the low 70s, which meant that by age 15, he wasn't even qualifying for the major event's main 64-man draw. When ETA opened, his ranking among the boys' 18s hovered around 10, and he was relegated to a middle spot on the Academy's B squad, a mediocrity that sort of becalmed his verve even further. His style was essentially that of a baseliner, a counterpuncher, but without the return of serve or passing shots you need to stand much of a chance against a quality netman. The ETA rap on Oren was that he lobbed well, but too often. He did have a phenomenal lob. He could hug the curve of the dome of the lung and 3 times out of 4 nail a large sized coin placed on the opposite baseline. He and Marlon Bain and 2 or 3 other marginal counterpunching boys at ETA all had phenomenal lobs, honed through spare PM devoted more and more to Eschaton, which by the most plausible account a Croatian refugee transfer had brought up from the Palm Academy in Tampa. Oren was Eschaton's first game master at ETA, where in the first Eschaton generations it was mostly marginal and de-athletized upperclassmen who played. College was the comparatively obvious choice then for Oren as the time of decision drew nigh. Oblique family pressures aside, as a low ranked player at ETA, he had stiffer academic demands than did those for whom the real show had seemed like a viable goal. Anti-eschatonology helped a great deal with the math computer stuff. ETA tended to be a bit weak in, both himself and Schtitt being at that point pretty anti-quantitative. His grades were solid. His board scores weren't going to embarrass anybody. Oren was basically academically sound, especially for somebody with a top level competitive sport on his secondary transcript. And You have to understand that mediocrity is relative in a sport like junior tennis. A national ranking of 74 in boys 18 and under singles, while mediocre by the standards of aspiring pros, is enough to make most college coaches' chins shiny. Oren got a couple Pac 10 offers, Big 10 offers. University of New Mexico actually hired a mariachi band that established itself under his dorm room's window 6 nights running until Mrs. Incandenza got himself to authorized FDV hard to electrify the fences. Ohio State flew him out to Columbus for such a weekend of perspective orientation that when Oren got back, he had to stay in bed for 3 days drinking Alka Seltzer with an ice pack on his groin. Caltech offered him an ROTC waiver and AP standing in their elite strategic studies program after Decade magazine had run a short interest piece on Oren and the Croat and Eschaton's applied use of C pink times 2. Oren chose BU Boston University, not a tennis power, not in Caltech's league academically, not the sort of place that hires bands or flies you out for Roman orgies of inducement. And only just about 3 clicks down the hill, and Commonwealth Avenue from ETA, west of the bay, around the intersection of Commonwealth and Beacon, Boston. It was kind of a joint Oren Incandenza Avril Incandenza decision. Oren's moms privately thought it was important for Oren to be away from home, psychologically speaking, but still to be able to come home whenever he wished. She put everything to Oren in terms of worrying that her concern over what would be best for him psychologically might prompt her to overstep her maternal bounds and speak out of turn or give intrusive advice. According to all her lists and advantage disadvantage charts, BU was from every angle far and away O's best choice. But to keep ever from overstepping or lobbying intrusively, the moms actually for 6 weeks would flee any room Oren entered, both hands clapped over her mouth. Oren had this way his face would get when she'd beg him not to let her influence his choice. It was during this period that Oren had characterized the moms to Hal as a kind of contortionist with other people's bodies, which Hal's never been able to forget. Himself, from his own experience, probably thought it'd be better for Oren to get the hell out of Dodge altogether, do something Midwest or PAC, but he kept his own counsel. He never had to struggle not to overstep. He probably figured Oren was a big boy. This was 4 years and 30 some released entertainments before himself put his head in a microwave oven, fatally. Then it turned out Averil's adoptive slash half brother Charles Travis, who at this time was back chairing ASA at Throppinghamshire, turned out to be old minor sport athletic administration network friends with Boston University's varsity tennis coach. Tavis flew down special on Air Canada to set up a meet between the four of them, Avril and Son and Tavis and the BU tennis coach. The BU tennis coach was a septuagenaric Ivy League guy, one of those emptily, craggly, handsome old patrician men whose profile looks like it ought to be on a coin, who liked his lads to wear all white and actually literally fault the net, win or lose, after matches. BU had only had a couple nationally ranked players like ever, and that had been in the AD 1960s, way before this fashion conscious guy's tenure. And when the coach saw Oren play, he about fell over sideways. Recall how mediocrity is contextual. BU's players all hailed literally from New England country clubs and wore iron shorts and those faggy white tennis sweaters with that blood colored stripe across the chest, and talked without moving their jaw, and played the sort of stiff and patrician serve and volley game you play if you had lots of summer lessons and clap around robins, but had never ever had to get out there and kill or die psychically. Oren wore cut-off jeans, deck sneakers without socks, and yawned compulsively as he beat BU's immaculately groomed number one singles man 2-0, hitting something like 40 offensive lobs for winners. Then at the four-way meeting Tavis arranged, the old BU coach showed up in LL Bean chinos and a Lacoste polo shirt and got a look at the size of Oren's left arm, and then at Oren's mom's in a tight black skirt and Levantine jacket with kohl around her eyes and a mousse tower of hair and about fell back over sideways the other way. She had this effect on older men somehow. Oren was in a position to dictate terms limited only by the parameters of BU's own sports budget marginality. Oren signed a letter of intent accepting a full ride to BU, plus books and a Hitachi laptop with software and off campus housing and living expenses and a lucrative work study job where his job was to turn on the sprinklers every morning at the BU Football Terriers' historic Nickerson Field, sprinklers that were already on automatic timers. The sprinklers job was BU's tennis team's one plum recruitment wise. Charles Tavis, who at Avril's urging that fall cashed in his Canadian return ticket and stayed on as assistant headmaster to assist Oren's father's oversight of the academy in a progressively more and more total capacity as both in and external travels, took J.O. Incandenza away from Enfield more and more often. Said 3.5 years later that he'd never really expected a thank you from Oren anyway for liaisoning with the BU tennis apparatus, that he wasn't in this for the thank yous, that a person who did a service for somebody's gratitude was more like a 2D cutout image of a person than a bona fide person. At least that's what he thought, he said. He said, what did Avril and Hal and Mario think? Was he a genuine 3D person? Was he perhaps just rationalizing away some legitimate hurt? Did Oren maybe resent him for seeming to move in just as he, Oren, moved out? Though surely not for Tavis assuming more and more total control of the ETA helm as J.O. Incandenza spent increasingly long hiati, either off with Mario on shoots or editing in his room off the tunnel or in an alcohol rehabilitative facilities, 13 of them over those final 3 years. Tavis has the Blue Cross statements right here. And even more surely, not for the final philo de se anyone with any kind of denial free sensitivity could have predicted over the past 3.5 years, but CT opined on July 4th YDPAH after Oren, who now had plenty of free summer time, declined his fifth straight invitation back to Enfield and his family's annual barbecue and Wimbledon finals interlaced spontaneous dissemination watching. Oren might just be harboring a resentment over CT moving into the headmaster's office and changing the doors te oxidare possunt before himself's microwaved head had even cooled, even if it was to take over a headmaster's job that had been positively keening to have someone sedulous and brisk take over. Incandenza himself, having eliminated his own map on April 1st of the year of the trial-sized dove bar, just as spring letters of intent were due from seniors who decided to slouch off to college tennis, just as invitations for the European Third Circuit invitationals were pouring in all over lateral Alice Moore's paraboloid desk, just as ETA's tax-exempt status was coming up for review before the MDR exemption panel, just as the school was trying to readjust to new ONANTA accreditation procedures after years of USTA accreditation procedures, just as litigations with Enfield Marine Public Health Hospital over alleged damage from ETA's initial hilltop flattening, and with Empire waste displacement over the flight paths of concavity-bound displacement vehicles were reaching the appellate stage, just as applications and fellowships for the fall term were in the final stages of review and response. Well, someone had to come in and fill the void, and that person was going to have to be someone who could achieve total worry without becoming paralyzed by the worry or by the absence of minimal thank yous for inglorious duties discharged in the stead of a person whose replacement was naturally going to come in for some resentment, Tavis felt, since since you can't get mad at a dying man, much less at a dead man, who better to assume the stress of filling in as anger object than that dead man's thankless, inglorious, sigilless, untiring 3D bureaucratic assistant and replacement, whose own upstairs room was right next to the HMA's master bedroom, and who might, by some grieving parties, be viewed as some kind of interloping usurper. Tavis had been ready for all this stress and more, he told the assembled academy in preparatory remarks before last year's fall term convocation, speaking through amplification from the red and gray bunting draped crow's nest of Gerhard Stitt's transom down to the rows of folding chairs arranged all along the base and sidelines of ETA's courts 6 to 9. He not only fully accepted the stress and resentment, he said he had worked hard and would continue in his dull, quiet, unromantic fashion to work hard to remain open to it, to this resentment and sense of loss in irreplaceability, even after 4 years, to let everyone who needed to get it out. The anger and resentment and possible contempt for their own psychological health, since Tav has acknowledged publicly that there was more than enough on every ETA's plate to begin with, as it was. The convocation assembly was outside on the center courts that in winter are sheltered by the lung. It was August 31st in the year of dairy products from the American heartland, hot and muggy. Upperclassmen who'd heard the same basic remarks for the past 4 years made little razor to jugular and hangman's noose over imaginary cross-beam motions, listening. The sky overhead was glassy blue between clots and strings of clouds moving swiftly north. On courts 30 to 32, the applied music chorus guys kept up a background of tenebre facte sunt, sotto voce. Everybody had on the black armbands everybody still wore for functions and assemblies to keep from forgetting. And the cotton US and crisp nylon ONA and flags flapped and clanged halfway down the driveway's poles in remembrance. The Sunstrand Plaza still has of that fall hadn't yet found a way to muffle its East Newton ATH-SCME fans, and Tavis' voice, which even with the police bullhorn tended to sound distant and receding anyway, wove in and out of the sound of the fans and the whump of the EWD catapults and locusts, electric screams, and the exhaust-rich hot rush of the summer wind up off Commonwealth Avenue, and the car horns and Green Line's trundle and clang and the clank of the flagpoles and wires, and everybody but the staff and the littlest kids up front missed most of Tavis' explanation that Sally Law had nothing to do with the fact that there was simply no way the late Hatmaster's beloved spouse and ETA Dean of Academic Affairs and of Females, Mrs. Avril in Cadenza, could have become headmaster. How would headmistress have sounded? And she had the females and female prorectors and Hardy's custodians to oversee, and curricula and assignments and schedules and complex new ONA and T and accreditation to finalize the Kafkan. Application for plus daily HMH sterilization and personal ablution rituals and the constant battle against anthracnose and dry climate blight in the dining rooms, green babies, plus, of course, ETA teaching duties on top of that, with the addition of untold sleepless nights with the militant grammarians of Massachusetts, the academic PAC that watchdogged media syntax, and invited florid fish-lipped guys from the French Academy to come speak with trilled R's on prescriptive preservation and held marathon multi-readings of Orwell's Politics and the English Language, and whose Avril chaired tactical phalanx was then, unsuccessfully turned out, court fighting the new Gentle administration's Title II G public funded library phase out fat trimming initiative. Besides, of course, being practically laid out flat with grief and having to do all the emotional processing work attendant on working through that kind of personal trauma, on top of all of which, assuming the administrative tiller of ETA itself would have been simply an insupportable burden, she's thanked CT effusively on more than one public occasion for leaving the plush sinecure of Throbbingshire and coming down to undertake the stress-ridden tasks not only of bureaucratic administration and ensuring as smooth a transition as possible, but of being there for the Incandenza family itself, with or without thank yous, and for helping support not only Oren's career and institutional decision processes, but also for being there supportively for all involved when Oren made a seminal choice not to go ahead and play competitive college tennis after all at BU. What happened was that by the third week of his freshman year, Oren was attempting an extremely unlikely defection from college tennis to college football. The reason he gave his parents, Avril, made it clear that the very last thing she wanted was to have any of her children feel they had to justify or explain to her any sort of abruptly or even bizarrely sudden major decision they might happen to make. And it's not clear that the mad stork had even nailed down the fact that Orrin was still in Metro Boston at BU in the first place, but Orrin still felt the move demanded some kind of explanation. Was that fall tennis practice had started and he discovered that he was an empty, withered psychic husk, competitively burned out? Orrin had been playing, eating, sleeping, and excreting competitive tennis since his racket was bigger than he was. He said he realized that at 18 he had become exactly as fine a tennis player as he was ever destined to be. The prospect of further improvement, a crucial carrot that Stitt and the ETA staff were expert at dangling, had disappeared at a fourth-rate tennis program whose coach had a poster of Bill Tilden in his office and offered critique on the level of bend your knees and watch the ball. This was all actually true, the burnout part, and totally swallowable as far as the from tennis part went, but Orrin had a harder time explaining the decisions to football component, partly because he had only the vaguest understanding of US football's rules, tactics, and non-metric venue. He had, in fact, never once even touched a real pebbled leather football before, and like most serious tennis players, had always found the misshapen ball's schizoid bounces disorienting and upsetting to look at. In fact, the decision had very little to do with football at all, or with the reason Orrin ended up starting to give before Avril at all, but demanded that he stop feeling in any way pressured or compelled to do anything more than ask for their utter and unqualified support of whatever actions he felt his personal happiness required. Which is what she did when he started a slightly lyrical thing about the crash of pads and cis boomba of pep squad and ambience of male bonding and smell of dewy turf at Nickerson Field at dawn when he showed up to watch the sprinklers come on and turn the lemon wedge of rising sun into plumed rainbows of refraction. The refracting sprinklers part was actually true and that he liked it. The rest had been fiction. The real football reason, in all its inevitable real reason banality, was that over the course of weeks of dawns of watching the auto sprinklers and the pep squad, which really did practice at dawn practices, Orrin had developed a horrible schoolboy grade crush, complete with dilated pupils and weak knees, for a certain big haired sophomore baton twirler. He watched twirl and strut from a distance through the diffracted spectrum of the plumed sprinklers, all the way across the field's dewy turf, a twirler who'd attended a few of the all-athletic team mixers Orrin and his strabismic BU doubles partner had gone to, and who danced the same way she twirled, and invoked mass pep, which is to say in a way that seemed to turn everything solid in Orrin's body watery and distant and oddly refracted. Orrin in Condensa, who, like many children of raging alcoholics and OCD sufferers, had internal addictive sexuality issues, had already drawn idle little sideways eights on the postcoital flanks of a dozen BU coeds. But this was different. He'd been smitten before, but not decapitated. He lay on his bed in the autumn PMs during the tennis coach's required nap time, squeezing a tennis ball and talking for hours about this twirling sprinkler obscured sophomore while his doubles partner lay way on the other side of the huge bed looking simultaneously at Orrin and at the any leaves changing color in the trees outside the window. The schoolboy epithet they'd made up to refer to Orrin's twirler was the pea goat, for the prettiest girl of all time. It wasn't the entire attraction, but she really was almost grotesquely lovely. She made the moms look like the sort of piece of fruit you think you want to take out of the bin, but then once the sort of piece of fruit you think you want to take out of the bin, you're right there over the bin, you put back because from close up you can see a much fresher and less preserved seeming piece of fruit elsewhere in the bin. The twirler was so pretty that not even the senior BU football terriers could summon the saliva to speak to her at athletic mixers. In fact, she was almost universally shunned. The twirler induced in heterosexual males what UHID later told her was termed the Akaton complex, which is a kind of deep phylogenic fear of transhuman beauty. About all Oren's doubles partner, who as a strabismic was something of an expert on female unattainability, felt he could do was warn O that this was the kind of hideously attractive girl he just knew in advance did not associate with normal collegiate human males and clearly attended BU athletic social functions only out of a sort of bland scientific interest while she waited for the cleft chinned escapardic male model looking wildly successful in business adult male she doubtless was involved with to telephone her from the backseat of his green stretch infinity, etc. No major sport player had ever even orbited in close enough to hear the elisions and apical lapses of a mid-southern accent in her oddly flat but resonant voice that sounded like someone enunciating very carefully inside a soundproof enclosure. When she danced at dances, it was with other cheerleaders and twirlers and pep squad carrierettes, because no male had the grit or spit to ask her. Oren himself couldn't get closer than 4 meters at parties because he suddenly couldn't figure out where to put the stresses in the Charles Tavis unwittingly inspired describe the sort of man you find attractive and I'll affect the demeanor of that sort of man strategic opening that had worked so well on other BU subjects. It took 3 hearings for him to figure out that her name wasn't Joelle. The big hair was red gold, and the skin peachy tinged pale, and arms freckled and zygomatics indescribable, and her eyes an extra natural HD green. He wouldn't learn till later that the almost pungently clean line dried laundry scent that hung about her was a special low pH dandelion attar decocted special by her chemist daddy in Shiny Prize, Kentucky. Boston University's tennis team, needless to say, had neither cheerleaders nor baton twirling pep squads, which were reserved for major and large crowd sports. This is pretty understandable. The tennis coach took Oren's decision hard, and Oren had to hand him a Kleenex and stand there for several minutes under the poster of an avuncular Big Bill Tilden standing there in World War II era long white pants and ruffling a ball boy's hair, Oren watching the Kleenex sogify and get holes blown through it while he tried to articulate just what he meant by burned out and withered husk and carrot. The coach had kept asking if this meant Oren's mother wouldn't be coming down to watch practice anymore. Oren's now former doubles partner, a strabismic and faggy sweatered but basically decent guy, who also happened to be the heir of the Nickerson Farms meat facsimile fortune, had his cleft-chinned and solidly BU-connected dad make a couple quick calls from the back seat of his forest green Lexus. BU's head football coach, the Boss Terrier, an exiled Oklahoman who really did wear a gray crewneck sweatshirt with a whistle on a string, was intrigued by the size of the left forearm and hand extended, impolitely but intriguingly, during introductions. This was Oren's tennis arm, roughly churn-sized. The other, whose dimensions were human, was hidden under a sport coat draped strategically over the aspiring walk-on's right shoulder. But you can't play U.S. football with a draped sport coat, and Oren's real speed was in tiny 3-meter lateral bursts. And then it turned out that the idea of actually making direct physical contact with an opponent was so deeply ingrained as alien and horrific that Oren's tryouts, even at reserve positions, were too pathetic to describe. He was called a drag ass, and then a mollygag, and then a bona fide pussy. He was finally told that he seemed to have some kind of empty swinging sack where his balls ought to be, and that if he wanted to keep his scholarship, he might ought to stick to minor type sports where what you hit didn't up and hit you back. The coach finally actually grabbed Oren's face mask and pointed to the mouth of the field's southern tunnel. Oren walked off south of the field solo and disconsolate, helmet under his little right arm, with not even a wistful glance back at the pep squad's pea goat practicing baton aloft splits in a heart-rendingly distant way beneath the visitors' northern goalposts. What Metro Boston AAs are trite but correct about is that both Destiny's Kisses and its dope slaps illustrate an individual person's basic personal powerlessness over the really meaningful events in his life, i.e., almost nothing important that ever happens to you happens because you engineer it. Destiny has no beeper. Destiny always leans trench coated out of an alley with some sort of psst that you usually can't even hear because you're in such a rush to or from something important you've tried to engineer. The Destiny Grade event that happened to Oren and Cadenza at this point was that just as he was passing glumly under the home goalposts and entering the shadow of the south exit tunnels added a loud and ominously orthopedic cracking sound, plus then shrieking, issued from somewhere on the field behind him. What had happened was that BU's best defensive tackle, a 180-kilo future pro who had no teeth and liked to color, practicing special teams punt rushes, not only blocked BU's varsity punter's kick, but committed a serious mental error and kept coming and crashed into the little padless guy while the punter's cleated foot was still up over his head, falling on him in a beefy heap and snapping everything from femur to tarsus in the punter's leg with a dreadful high-caliber snap. Two pep majorettes and a water boy fainted from the sound of the punter's screams alone. The blocked punt's ball caromed hard of the defensive tackle's helmet and bounced crazily and rolled unattended all the way back to the shadow of the south tunnel where Oren had turned to watch the punter thrive and the lineman rise with a finger in his mouth and a guilty expression. The defensive line coach disconnected his headset and dashed out and began blowing his whistle at the lineman at extremely close range over and over as the huge tackle started to cry and hit himself in the forehead with the heel of his hand. Since nobody else was close, Oren picked up the blocked punt's ball, which the head coach was gesturing impatiently for from his position at the midfield bench. Oren held the football, which he'd not been very good at during tryouts, holding on to it, feeling its weird oval weight, and looked way upfield at the stretcher bearers and punter and assistants and coach. It was too far to try to throw, and there was just no way Oren was making another solo walk up the sideline and then back up the field again under the distant green gaze of the twirler who owned his CNS. Oren, before that seminal moment, had never tried to kick any sort of ball before in his entire life. It was the unengineered and kind of vulnerable revelation that ended up moving Joel Van Dyne way more than status or hang time. But as of that moment, as whistles fell from lips and people pointed, and under that same green and sprinkler-hazed gaze, Oren found for himself within competitive U.S. football a new niche and carrot, a show-type career he could never have dreamed of trying to engineer. Within days, he was punting 60 yards without a rush, practicing solo on an outside field with the special teams assistant, a dreamy Gaulois smoking man who invoked ideas of sky and flight and called Oren Ephebe, which a discreet phone call to his youngest brother revealed not to be the insult Oren had feared it sounded like. By the second week, O was up around 65 yards, still without a snap or sounded like. By snap or rush, his rhythm clean and faultless, his concentration on the transaction between one foot and one leather egg almost frighteningly total. Nor by the third week was he much distracted by the 10 crazed, pituitary giants bearing down as he took the snap and stepped forward, the gasps and crunching and meaty splats of interpersonal contact around him, the coolie-type shuffle of the stretcher-bearers who came and went after the whistles blew. He'd been taken aside, and the empty scrotum back crack apologized for, and it had been explained, complete with blow-ups of rule-book pages, that regulations against direct physical contact with the punter were draconian, enforced by the threat of massive yardage and loss of possession. The rifle-shot sounds of the ex-punter's now useless legs were one in a million sounds, he was assured. The head coach let Oren overhear him telling the defense that any man misfortunate enough to impact the team's new stellar punt man could just keep on walking after the play was over, all the way to the South Tunnel and the stadium exit and the nearest transportation to some other institution of learning and ball. It was, pretty obviously, the start of football season. Crisp air, everything half dead, burning leaves, hot chocolate, raccoon coats, and halftime twirling, and something called the wave. Crowds exponentially larger and more demonstrative than tennis tournament crowds. Home versus SUNY Buffalo, home versus Syracuse, AT Boston College, AT Rhode Island, home versus the despised Minutemen of UMass Amherst. Oren's average reached 69 yards per kick and was still improving, his eyes fixed on the twin inducements of a gleaming baton and a massive developmental carrot he hadn't felt since age 14. He punted the football better and better as his motion, a dancerly combination of moves and weight transfers, every bit as complex and precise as a kick serve, got more instinctive, and he found his hamstrings and adductors loosening through constant and high impact competitive punting, his left cleat finishing at 90 degrees to the turf, knee to his nose, rocket kicking in the midst of crowd noise so rabid and entire it seemed to remove stadium's air, the one huge wordless orgasmic voice rising and creating a vacuum that sucked the ball after it into the sky, the leather egg receding as it climbed in a perfect spiral, seeming to chase the very crowd roar it had produced. By Halloween, his control was even better than his distance. It wasn't by accident that the special teams assistant described it as touch. Consider that a football field is basically just a grass tennis court, tucked unnaturally long, and that wide lines at complex right angles still define tactics and movement, the very possibility of play. And that Oren and Cadenza, who tennis historically had had mediocre passing shots, had been indicted by Stitt for depending way too often on the job he developed as compensation. Like the equally weak passing Eschaton prodigy Michael Pimulis after him, Oren's whole limited game had been built around a preternatural lob, which, of course, a lob is just a higher than opponent parabola that ideally lands just shy of the area of play's rear boundary and is hard to retrieve and return. Gerhard Stitt and the Lind and their depressed prorectors had to sit eating butterless popcorn through only one cartridge of one BU game to understand how Oren had found his major sport niche. Oren was still just only lobbing, Stitt observed, illustrating with the pointer and a multiple replayed fourth down, but now with the leg instead, the only punting, and now with 10 armored and testosterone flushed factotum to deal with whatever return an opponent could muster. Stitt posited that Oren had stumbled by accident on the way in this grotesquely physical and territorial U.S. game to legitimate the same dependency on the one shot of lob that had kept him from developing the courage to develop his weaker areas, which is which this unwillingness to risk the temporary failure and weakness for long-term gaining had been the real herbicide on the carrot of Oren and Cadenza's tennis. Puberty schmurberty as the real reason for burning down the inside fire of tennis, Stitt knew. Stitt's remarks were nodded vigorously at and largely ignored in the viewing room. Stitt later told the Lind he had several very bad feelings about Oren's future inside. But so by freshman Halloween, Oren was regularly placing his punts inside the opponent's 20, spinning the ball off his cleats, laces so it either hit and squiggled outside the wide sideline and out of play, or else landed on its point and bounced straight up and seemed to squat in the air, hovering and spinning, waiting for some downfield terrier to kill it just by touching. The special teams assistant told Oren that these were historically called coffin corner kicks, and that Oren and Cadenza was the best natural coffin corner man he'd lived to see. You almost had to smile. Oren's full ride scholarship was renewed under the aegis of a brutaler but way more popular North American sport than competitive tennis. This was after the second home game, around the time that a certain actionizingly pretty baton twirler invoking mass pep during breaks in the action seemed to begin somehow directing her glittering sideline routines at Oren in particular. So, and then the only really cardiac grade romantic relationship of Oren's life took bilateral root at a distance during games, without one exchanged personal phoneme, a love communicated across grassy expanses against stadiums' monovocal roar, entirely through stylized repetitive motions. His functional, hers celebrity, their respective little dances of devotion through the spectacle, they were both in their different roles, trying to make as entertaining as possible. But so the point was that the accuracy came after the distance. In his first couple games, Oren had approached his fourth down task as one of simply kicking the ball out of sight and past hope of return. The dreamy ST assistant said this was a punter's natural pattern of growth and development. Your raw force tends to precede your control. In his initial home start, wearing a padless uniform that didn't fit in a wide receiver's number, he was summoned when BU's first drive stalled on the 40 of a Syracuse team that had no idea it was in its last season of representing an American university. A side issue. College sport analysts would later use the game to contrast the beginning and end of different eras. But a side issue. Oren had a book along of 73 yards that day and an average hang of 8 point something seconds. But that first official punt exhilarated the carrot, the pea goat, the monovocal roar of a major sport crowd. He sent over the head of the Orangemen back waiting to receive it, over the goalposts and the safety nets behind the goalposts, over the first three sections of seats, and into the lap of an emeritus theology professor in row 52, who needed opera glasses to make out the play itself. It went in the books at 40 yards, that baptismal competitive punt. It was really almost a 90-yard punt and had the sort of hang time the special teams assistant said you could have tender and sensitive intercourse during. The sound of the podiatric impact had silenced the major sport crowd, and the retired USMC flyer, who always came with petroleum jelly samples he hawked to the knuckle-chapped crowds in the Nickerson stands, told his cronies in the Brooklyn watering hole after the game that this Incandenzas kid's first public punt had sounded just the way Rolling Thunder's big-bellied Berthas had sounded, the exaggerated whump of incendiary tonnage, way larger than life. After 4 weeks, Oren's successes at kicking big egg-shaped balls was way past anything he'd accomplished hitting little round ones. Granted, the tennis and echelon hadn't hurt, but it wasn't all athletic, this affinity for the public punt. It wasn't all just high level competitive training and high pressure experience transported intersport. He told Joelle Van Dyne, she of the accent and baton and brain locking beauty, told her in the course of an increasingly revealing conversation after kind of amazingly she had approached him at a Columbus Day major sports function and asked him to autograph a squishy sided football he'd kicked a hole through in practice. The deflated bladder had landed in the marching terrier's sousaphone player's sousaphone and had been handed over to Joelle after extrication by the lardy tubist, sweaty and dumb under the girl's actiously imploring glaze, asked him, Oren, now also suddenly damp and blank on anything attractive to say or recite, asked him in an emptily resonant drawl to inscribe the punctured thing for her own personal daddy, one Joe Lon Van Dyne of Shiny Price, Kentucky, and she said also of the Dyne Riney Proton Donor Region Corporation of nearby Boaz, Kentucky, and engaged him, in a slowly decreasingly one-sided social function type conversation. The P-goat was pretty easy to stay in a one-to-one like tete-a-tete with, since no other terrier could bring himself within 4 meters of her, and Oren gradually found himself almost meeting her eye as he shared that he believed it wasn't all athletic, punting's pull for him, that a lot of it seemed emotional and, or even if there was such a thing anymore, spiritual, a denial of silence. There were upwards of 30,000 voices, souls, voicing approval as one soul. He invoked the raw numbers, the frenzy. He was thinking out loud here. Audience exhortations and approval so total they ceased to be numerically distinct and melded into a sort of single coital moan. One big vowel, the sound of the womb, the roar gathering, tidal, amniotic, the voice of what might as well be God. None of tennis's prime applause cut short by an umpire's patrician shush. He said he was just speculating here ad libbing. He was meeting her eye and not drowning, his dread now transformed into whatever had been dread of. He said the sound of all those souls as one sound too loud to bear, building, waiting for his foot to release it. Orrin said the thing he thought he liked was he literally could not hear himself think out there. Maybe a cliche, but out there, transformed. His own self transcended as he'd never escaped himself on the court, a sense of a presence in the sky, the crowd sound congregational, the stadium shaking climax as the ball climbed and inscribed the cathedral arch, seeming to take forever to fall. It never even occurred to him to ask her what sort of demeanor she preferred. He didn't have to strategize or even scheme. Later he knew what the dread had been dread of. He hadn't had to promise her anything, it turned out. It was all for free. By the end of this freshman fall and BU's championship of the Yankee Conference, plus its non victorious but still unprecedented appearance at Las Vegas dignitary attended KLRMKI Forcia Bowl, Orrin had taken his off campus housing subsidy and moved with Joelle Van Dyne, the heart stopping Kentuckian, into an East Cambridge co op, 3 subway stops distance from BU, and the all new inconveniences of being publicly stellar in a major sport in a city where people beat each other to death in bars over stats and fealty. Joelle had done the midnight Thanksgiving dinner at ETA and survived Avril, and then Orrin spent his first Christmas ever away from home flying to Paducah and then driving a rented four-wheel drive to kudzu hung Shiny Price, Kentucky to drink toadies under a little white reusable Christmas tree with all red balls with Joelle and her mother and personal daddy and his loyal pointers getting a storm cellar tour of Joe Lone's incredible Pyrex collection of every solution in the known world that can turn blue litmus paper red, little red rectangles floating in the flasks for proof. Orrin nodding a lot and trying incredibly hard, and Joelle saying that Mr. Van Dees not once smiling at him was just his way, was all, the way his own mom's had her way Joelle had trouble with. Orrin wired Marlon Dane and Russ Reed and the strabismic Nickerson that he was, by all indications, in love with somebody. Freshman New Year's Eve in Shiny Price, far from the ONA-night upheavals of the new Northeast, the last PM before subsidization was the first time Orrin saw Joelle ingest very small amounts of cocaine. Orrin had exited his own substance phase about the time he discovered sex, plus, of course, the NONANCAA urine considerations, and he declined it, the cocaine, but not in a judgmental or killjoy way, and found he liked being with this pea goat straight while she ingested. He found it exciting, a vicariously on the edge feeling he associated with giving yourself not to any one game's definition, but to yourself and how you unjudgmentally feel about somebody who's high and feeling even freer and better than normal with you alone under the red balls. They were a natural match here. Her ingestion then was recreational, and he not only did not mind, but never made a show of not minding, nor she that he abstained. The whole substance issue was natural and kind of free. Another reason they seemed star fated was that Joelle had, in her sophomore year, decided to concentrate in film cartridge academically at BU, either film cartridge theory or film cartridge production, or maybe both. The Peagoat was a film fanatic, though her tastes were pretty corporate. She told she preferred movies where a whole bunch of shit blows up. Orrin, in a low key way, introduced her to art film, conceptual and highbrow academic avant and upregard film, and taught her how to use some of the interlaces more esoteric menus. He blasted up the hill to Enfield and brought down the Mad Stork's own prenuptial agreement of heaven and hell, which had a major impact on her. Right after Thanksgiving himself led the pea-goat understudy with Leith on the set of The American Century as Seen Through a Brick, in return for getting to film her thumb against a plucked string. After an only mildly disappointing sophomore season, O flew with her to Toronto to watch part of the filming of Blood Sister, One Tough Nun. Himself would take Orrin and his beloved out after dailies, entertaining Joelle with his freakish gift for Canadian cab hailing, while Oren stood turtle-headed in his top coat. And then later, Oren would shepherd the two of them back to their Ontario Place hotel, stopping the cab to let them both throw up, firemen carrying Joel while he watched the mad stork negotiate his suite by holding onto walls. Himself showed them the University of Toronto Conference Center where he and the moms had first met. This might have been the end's start, gradually, in hindsight. Joel that summer declined a sixth summer at the Dixie Baton Twirling Institute in Oxford, Mass, and let himself give her a stage name and use her in rapid succession in Low Temperature Civics, The Desire to Desire, and Safe Boating is No Accident, traveling with himself and Mario while Oren stayed in Boston, recuperating from minor surgery on a hypertrophied left quadriceps at a Massachusetts General Hospital where no fewer than four nurses and PTs in the sports medicine wing filed for legal separation from their husbands with custody. The pea goat's real ambitions weren't thespian, Oren knew. It's one reason he hung in so long. Joelle, when he'd met her, already owned some modest personal film equipment, courtesy of her personal daddy, and she now had access to nothing if not serious digital gear. By Oren's sophomore year, she no longer twirled or incited Pep in any way. In his first full season, she stood behind various white lines with a little Bolex R32 digital recorder and BTL meters and lenses, including a bitching Angenieux Zoom O, gone and paid for as a gesture, and she shot little half-disc sector clips of 78 BU punter, sometimes with Leaf in attendance, never himself, experimenting with speed and focal length and digital mats, extending herself technically. Oren, despite his interest in upgrading the Peagoat's commercial taste, was himself pretty lukewarm on film and cartridges and theater and pretty much anything that reduced him to herd-like spectation. But he respected Joel's own creative drives to an extent, and he found out that he really did like watching the football footage of Joel Van Dyne, featuring pretty much him only, strongly preferred the little .5 sector clips to himself's cartridges or corporate films where things blew up while Joelle bounced in her seat and pointed at the viewer. And he found them, her clips of him at play, way more engaging than the grainy, overcluttered game and play celluloids the head coach made everybody sit through. Oren liked to adjust the co-op's rheostat way down when Joelle wasn't home and haul out the diskettes and make Jiffy Pop and watch her little 10-second clips of him over and over. He saw something different each time he rewound, something more. The clips of him punting unfolded like time lapsing flowers and seemed to reveal him in ways he could never have engineered. He sat rapt. It only happened when he watched them alone. Sometimes he got an erection. He never masturbated. Joelle came home, still in the last stages of a late puberty and the prettiness getting visibly worse day by day. Joelle had been maiden still when Oren met her. She'd been shunned, therefore, both at BU and Shiny Prize Bows Consolidated. The beauty had repelled every comer. She devoted her life to her twirling and amateur film. Disney Leaf said she had the knack. Her camera hand was rock steady. Even the early clips from the start of the YW season looked shot of a tripod. There'd been no audio in the sophomore clips, and you could hear the high pitched noise of the cartridge in the T piece disk drive. A cartridge revolving at a digital diskette's 450 rotations per minute sounds a bit like a distant vacuum cleaner. Late night car noises and sirens drifted in through the bars from as far away as the Storo 500. Silence was not part of what Oren was after watching. Joelle housekeeps like a fiend. The place is always sterile. The resemblance to the mom's housekeeping he finds a bit creepy. Except Joelle does not mind a mess or give anybody the creeps worrying about hiding that she minds it so nobody's feelings will be hurt. With Joelle, the mess just disappears sometime during the night, and you wake up and the place is sterile. It's like elves. Soon after he started watching the clips in his junior year, Oren had blasted up Commonwealth's Hill and brought Joel back a Bolex compatible Tatsuoka recorder with sync pulse, a cardioid mic, a low end tripod with a Barney to muffle the Bolex's whir, a classy Pilotone blooper, and St. Paul's chords, a whole oracopia. It took Lee 3 weeks to teach her how to use the pilotone, now the clips had sound. Oren has trouble not burning the Jiffy popcorn. It tends to burn as the foil top inflates. You have to take it off the stove before the foil forms a dome. No microwave popcorn for Oren even then. He liked to dim the track lights when Joelle was out and haul out the cartridge rack and watch her little 10-second clips of his punts over and over. Here he's back against Delaware in the second home game of YTMP. The sky is dull and pale. The 5 Yankee Conference flags, University of Vermont and UNH, now history, are all right out straight with the gale of the Charles, for which Nickerson Field is infamous. It's 4th down, obviously. Thousands of kilos of padded meat assume 4-point stances and chuff at each other, poised to charge and stave. Oren is 12 yards back from scrimmage, his cleated feet together, his weight just ahead of himself, his mismatched arms out before him in the attitude of the blind before walls. His eyes are fixed on the distant grass-stained valentine of the center's ass. His stance, waiting to receive the snap, is not unlike a driver's he sees. 9 men on line, 4-pointed, poised to staff off 10 men's assault. The other team's deep back is back to receive, 70 yards away or more. The fullback, whose sole job is to keep Oren from harm, is ahead and to the left, bent at the knees, his taped fists together and elbows out like a winged thing, ready to hurl itself at whatever breaches the line and comes at the punter. Joelle's equipment isn't quite pro caliber, but her technique is very good. By junior year, there's also color. There's only one sound, and it is utter. The crowd's noise and its response to that noise building. Oren's back against Delaware, ready, his helmet a bright, non-contact white, and his head's inside scrubbed tree for 10 seconds, for every thought not connected to receiving the long snap and stepping martially forward to lob the leather egg beyond sight at an altitude that makes the wind no factor. Madame Pigot gets it all. Zooming in from the opposite end zone, she gets his timing. A punt's timing is minutely precise, like a serve's. It's like a solo dance. She gets the ungodly whoomp against and above the crowd's vowels climax. She captures the pendular 180 arc of Oren's leg, the gluteal follow-through that puts his cleats laces way over his helmet, the perfect right angle between leg and turf. Her technique is superb on the Delaware debacle. Oren can just barely take reviewing. The one time all year the big chuffing center oversnaps and arcs the ball over Oren's upraised hands, so by the time he's run back and grabbed the crazy bouncing thing 10 yards farther back, the Delaware defense has breached the line, or through the line. The fullback supine and trampled, all 10 rushers rushing, wanting nothing more than personal physical contact with Oren and his leather egg. Joelle gets him sprinting, a 3-meter lateral burst as he avoids the first few sets of hands, and the beefy curling lips, but is just about to get personally contacted and knocked out of his cleats by the Delaware strong safety flying in on a slant from way outside when the tiny 0.5 sector of digital space each punt's programmed to require runs out, and the crowd sound moose and dies, and you can hear the disk drive stalled at the terminal bite, and Oren's chin-strapped plastic bared face is there on the giant viewer, frozen and high def in his helmet right before impact, zoomed in on a quality lens. Of particular interest are the eyes.
Good grammar and spelling are important. But if you want to write essays that